best form factors for these AI agents are very much assistive in nature and solve certain types of tasks and do it relatively well instead of trying to bite off like a ton of things end to end. And I think over time, as the models get better and as people warm up to these types of interaction patterns, then you'll start to see a bit more trust in like a multi-step setting. So quantifying uncertainty means the AI agent at least knows where it doesn't know and can kind of specifically detect spots where it basically requires a little bit of like human review. And then you absolutely need citations, particularly if you're trying to process like a large number of documents and each document's like super long. Every piece of like extracted data should have some reference back to the source document. So this at least gives a human the ability to like verify that pretty quickly.
Welcome to Data Framed. This is Richie. AI agents have so much promise for automating all the tasks you don't want to do. Automate what you hate, as the saying goes. Of course, as soon as you decide you want to build some AI agents at work, you're faced with all sorts of tricky questions like, what sort of agents do you want to build and how are you going to make these agents actually work? These questions mean you need to understand a little bit about agent architecture and guardrails and evaluation. So today we're going to get into some of the practicalities of creating great AI agents. We're also going to discuss some of the hot topics in generative AI, such as do you actually need to be good at prompt engineering and what exactly can you do with these deep research tools? Our guest is Jerry Liu, the CEO and co-founder at LlamaIndex. LlamaIndex, the software, is a generative AI development framework. It's very popular. The company of the same name is designed to provide a commercial platform to support this, and it's got a focus on creating generative AI agents for document processing. So great enterprise use case. Jerry founded LlamaIndex coming from a background in technical AI. Previously, he led a machine learning monitoring team at Robust Intelligence, and he did self-driving AI research at Uber, and he worked on recommendation systems at Quora. Let's hear how to create great AI agents. Hi, Jerry. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Now, AI agents are, of course, massively hyped at the moment. I'm curious, are they really ready for the enterprise?
I think you're starting to see agents start to automate certain types of business workflows. I do think, a lot of the fully autonomous like AI engineers or, AI agents that can just do a complete job end to end are still probably a little bit away. Basically anything that will just do something end to end still hasn't like fully reached its potential. And I think this might just be due to some like new model developments coming up. But I think a lot of AI agents are already making an impact in a variety of different settings. So, I mean, a classic example is just a coding assistant. Literally everybody is using coding assistants these days. If you ask any engineer at a tech company, they're all using like Cursor, Windsurf, ChatGPT, et cetera. And then of course, you're seeing AI agents deliver real ROI in certain enterprise verticals. So this includes like customer service, this includes like IT help desk stuff. This also includes, areas that we're actually very specifically excited about, which is document workflow automation. Whether you're a finance team or procurement, legal, being able to sort through massive volumes of unstructured data and getting insights from it. I think one thing that people are realizing is, especially in the beginning, the best form factors for these AI agents are very much assistive in nature and solve certain types of tasks and do it relatively well instead of trying to bite off like a ton of things end to end. And I think over time, as the models get better and as people warm up to these types of interaction patterns, then you'll start to see a bit more trust in like a multi-step setting.
All right, lots of great use cases there. I'd love to hear more about what the challenges are. Like, where do you see the limits of agents in the enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of challenges if you think about it from a developer perspective. And I can speak to things that, we're solving. And then, of course, there's challenges that other players are solving too. One is if you're a developer building these types of agents for an enterprise, you have to figure out like some table stakes things. One is basically, what is exactly like the agent architecture that you're trying to go for? In general, if you're trying to build and deploy different types of agents, there's very like general reasoning architectures like chain of thought, React, function calling loops, Codact, etc., where you basically have an agent reasoning loop connected to a set of tools, and then the agent will dynamically figure out which tool to call to actually solve the task at hand. Oftentimes, this is a decent approach to get started. And actually, a lot of agents, consumer grade agents, if you look at it like ChatGPT, basically operate in this setting. I think the thing that people are skeptical about, especially for certain types of business use cases, are really about reliability and the ability to actually solve like certain types of tasks and do it well. And for those, oftentimes you need a little bit more constrained architectures where basically certain parts of that flow are deterministic and you're constraining like where LLMs can actually do decision making, whether it's like an if else statement, whether it's doing some sort of reflection, validation, so on and so forth. So I think one of the design decisions that an engineer has to make when you build and deploy agents is basically how constrained is that architecture and what is the scope of tasks that you're looking to solve. And solving more narrow tasks is obviously easier than solving something bigger. Another big thing is obviously eval. I mean, I think everybody kind of knows this, just making sure that you're able to have proper mechanisms for benchmarking, evaluating, making sure the agents actually work well and reliably. One piece that we're specifically excited about that I think a lot of developers and also companies tend to not think about as much is really the data problem. I think for a lot of these agents, they need access to massive amounts of unstructured enterprise data that they're not necessarily trained on at the beginning. And for them to actually access this data and interact with it in the right way, there has to be some sort of data layer to actually process, connect, ingest this data, structure it in the right ways, and then also serve it up as tools to an AI agent. A lot of use cases that we work with, whether it's, invoice processing, technical documentation search, kind of like structuring your healthcare records, et cetera, basically deal with massive volumes of this data. And being able to figure out how to actually structure this is actually a top priority for these developer teams.
So those are lots of great use cases for agents. I'm curious as to what the challenges are when you're adopting these in the enterprise. What are the limits here?
Yeah, so there's a lot of challenges if you're a developer looking to build and deploy agents in an enterprise setting. I'll just list a few off the top of my head. One is actually figuring out the right agent architecture. There's very general agent architectures like React, function calling, Kodak, et cetera, where you basically have a reasoning loop. And then all you have to do is plug in a set of tools. And then the agent will dynamically figure out how to use these tools to solve the task. A lot of consumer grade applications like ChatGPT basically use this type of architecture. And the advantage is it's pretty simple to set up. The disadvantage is you don't actually get a lot of guardrails. And sometimes you have reliability issues if you try to solve more constrained tasks. So the first is really figuring out, how do I actually start small and solve, a specific business problem within the enterprise first before generalizing the agent. Second is making sure that you have the right eval mechanisms to make sure that agent is actually functioning, working correctly. There's plenty of players in the space that have nice tools around evals and observability. And then the third, which is oftentimes underrated that we find, and it also happens to be something that we are directly working on, is the data problem. A lot of proper enterprise-grade agents depend on large volumes of unstructured data, particularly with the use cases that we work with our enterprise customers. And they basically need a data layer. Like you need something that will actually connect, process, structure your unstructured data in the right format so that your AI agents can have access to it. So, whether it's your structured data, whether it's unstructured documents like PDFs, PowerPoints, Word docs, being able to ingest, tag it with the right metadata, and create the endpoints, whether you're doing like RAG or whether you're performing different types of actions over this data, takes a surprisingly large amount of efforts and is actually something we're aiming to solve for the enterprise.
Okay, so I have to say, I do like that idea of just start with solving a simple problem, then maybe get more complex rather than trying to solve everything at once. And certainly lots of interesting points around like making sure you've got the right data, making sure it's structured in the right way, making sure you got the architecture right. Lots of things to for us to delve into. One thing, so you mentioned at the start, like one of the ideas was around having assistants to help you write code. This is sometimes called co-pilots. I know like there's the term agentic AI as well as AI agent. Do you want to talk about what are the different categories of agent?
I basically see it as a spectrum from less agentic to agentic, just from a pure architecture standpoint. Like there's things that will be relatively general and can do a lot of things. And then there are things that are basically computer programs, a little bit more deterministic, but have some AI agents in the loop that will help you solve specific types of tasks. And in terms of the specific UI UX for the user, I think I basically see two main categories. One, there's an assistant-based use case where you have a chat UI And, it depends on a lot of human interaction to basically make sure you get back the result that you want. And then the second is something that's like slightly more automation based, where, maybe this process runs in the background. It's actually plugged in as part of some like logger running process. It'll inspect your data, process this data, and then make decisions on it without the human in the loop, except potentially in like a batch review type setting. Those are probably the two main use cases. Like the first category is basically ChatGPT and slash like any sort of embedded copilot. And then the second category is something that's a little bit more like RPA flavor.
Okay, so you can go from really simple, it's just like it's basically chatbot that's using some tools through to something that's doing more thinking, working completely autonomously without that human sort of intervention.
Yeah, and to be clear, the assistant use case can also be relatively complex, as in it's not necessarily just like a chatbot. It can actually, generate entire files for you, allow you to do like data analysis, visualization, review. It's just like the nature of it is meant to be a little bit more like a co-pilot. So it like is like an assistant for the human. And then the second category is basically more like a program that runs in the background.
All right, that's cool. So I'm curious as to like what you think is the most advanced agent you've seen that actually works. Like how far can you go with this at the moment?
It's a good question. I mean, like I'm trying to think what use cases I've seen that actually work super well. I mean, I think just in the general sense, agents are getting really, really good at coding. I mean, it's very clear that, especially with the reasoning capabilities that they have, and the ability to just like generate large artifacts from scratch, one, being able to actually generate entire programs. This is where, ChatGPT itself can one shot like a computer program with stuff like, cursor, compose, or like, the composing, the agent feature, lovable, et cetera. Like, you basically get entire applications that can just build you full stack apps. We're starting to see that start to take shape. And, even though I said Devin can't like really help you solve software engineering, at least can build a relatively simple application for you end to end. That's probably the most like well-known type of like cool example. What we've seen in the enterprise setting is some really interesting stuff around kind of end-to-end process automation and also like financial analysis. Some of the customers that we work with have evolved beyond like a RAG chatbot into things that can just do like automated financial modeling on top of your documents. And then the output is also becoming a lot more sophisticated. Instead of just like giving back like chat responses, it can actually start generating entire PDFs, memos, reports, and also Excel spreadsheets. And so really having agents deeply involved in that knowledge work creation aspect is something that we're starting to see with some, companies a little bit more at the bleeding edge, and then figuring out the right patterns to generalize for other customers.
That's very cool. And certainly even like it may not be super exciting, but just generating a PDF from text is not something a human necessarily wants to have to do. Having that automated is just a nice little time saver.
And you're starting to see this right now, right? With I've been using OpenAI deep research quite a bit. For my own personal AI habits, I abuse like Claude, ChatGPT, and also like all the coding tools. But like deep research is pretty good for horizontal web-based research for like a general setting. What you'll probably see in like an enterprise setting is basically some version of that, but grounded within enterprise data and also specific workflows to basically create something that's a little bit more structured for a specific role. And that's actually, we've been doing a lot of work on creating the right architectures for this type of report generation setting and making it work well within the enterprise.
Can you talk me through more about how you go about using deep research? Like, what are the main use cases? How do you go about using it? Like, what do you do with it?
Yeah, I mean, I've been using it for just like general market understanding of the AI space. I actually use it to get information. It just does web research on its own. I go off, wait for like 10 minutes, come back, and then it comes back to me with analysis of like, different types of companies in the landscape. I've also used it to just like, this for me personally, I just use it to strategically learn about different functions. So like sales, marketing, like product, et cetera, and then incorporate those principles with my own context. And again, this is just me as like a consumer. I think the inspiration for me after using this type of stuff is like, there is some layer of tools like, ChatGPT, Claude, maybe the coding tools too, that are relatively horizontal in nature. You can use them to get a base layer of capability to just help solve your own tasks. And then, the way that we see ourselves like differentiating, especially in terms of building stuff a little bit more bespoke to the enterprise, is really one, ensuring it's actually grounded within, your enterprise knowledge base. And then two, that we're actually able to solve more domain specific workflows.
Okay, yeah, solving domain-specific workflows seems to be like the big sort of enterprise use case, because you've got all these sort of general purpose AI tools that work kind of well in a consumer sense, but once you get like kind of deep into one area, they seems to be where they fall over.
And the reason I think that matters is because, technically using a general tool, if you really figure out how to, or you're like a power user of ChatGPT, for instance, you can probably get it to do what you want. The main thing is there's like a significant amount of work, and like the best people that use best use of AI is like if you actually figure out the right prompts and figure out how to actually inject the right sets of context. And oftentimes for us, it's really like the idea of building a product experience, or the architecture and product experience on top of AI, is to simplify that for different types of users.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so certainly prompt engineering is like one of the more popular things that people want to learn about AI, but I guess there are more people who just can't even be bothered or don't have the time to learn about prompt engineering, so product experiences to take that barrier away, I presume.
I think so. It's like prompt engineering, or I mean, the prompt engineering, like the general sense, is like how you really learn some skills, and it takes time to really use like a general AI capabilities. And I think you see this with vertical AI agents too. A lot of it's really just like, how do I incorporate this with specific workflows and make that experience as easy as possible for different users?
Okay. Actually, while we're talking prompt engineering, do you have a top prompt engineering tip? How do you make your prompts better?
I have no idea. It's actually a little bit primitive. I've been concatenating everything in a giant text file and then just injecting about like 100,000 tokens worth of context into ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini these days.
Okay, yeah. So it sounds like if you've got 100,000 tokens worth of context, that's a lot of context for simple sort of questions. So I presume that's for the more advanced use case. But I like the idea of just providing more information, and that's probably going to get you better responses.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of it's really figuring out how to ask the right questions and then providing the right grounding.
All right, wonderful. Now, I'd love to talk a bit about the LlamaIndex framework. So that's kind of the open source software that's at the core of your business. Now, it seems like LlamaIndex had some very modest goals to begin with, just around being able to use your own either personal or corporate data in an AI application. It's grown a lot since then. So can you talk me through how has LlamaIndex evolved?
Yeah, for sure. And so it's actually been super interesting because the mission of the company was very simple to begin with. And even as, it's been around 2 years since we started the company. And obviously our product offerings have evolved a lot in the meantime. We're able to solve a lot more downstream use cases. But it's kind of interesting how we're still staying consistent with that core, pretty simple mission of connecting LLMs with your enterprise data. And, really the intuition at the time was more motivated by there were limited context windows in ChatGPT, like it was 4,000 tokens. Like, how do I figure out how to connect it to my entire enterprise knowledge base and really make use of this cool technology that had decent reasoning capabilities with, and use that on top of like this massive volume of data. That kind of led into everyone being interested in RAG in the early days of 2023. And two, everyone started becoming interested in RAG was kind of like a pretty primitive concept, actually building different types of more multi-step agentic workflows that can interact with your external services. And so, starting from the beginning, it was really meant to be a framework to make it easier for developers to connect LLMs with their external sources of data. And we built some initial patterns around RAG. And as people started building things that were a little bit more sophisticated, we started building some way deeper abstractions to make it easier to build more multi-step agentic systems. So in terms of how the project has changed over time, I think a lot of people knew us as a RAG framework back in 2023. Nowadays, I think we've actually fully made the pivot to like a multi-agent framework that appeals to both like beginner users as well as advanced users.
Okay, that is interesting how 2023 is kind of the dark ages of these sort of concepts. So it's interesting how things have changed. So what would you say like the most advanced thing you can do with LlamaIndex is now?
You can do stuff that's like pretty advanced. I mean, you can build your own like deep research assistant. You can build your own like coding assistant too if you want. I will say, I think over time, the framework has also gone like a tad more opinionated. And this goes hand in hand with our commercial offering, because our commercial offering, which we'll talk about in a bit is basically around like the document processing and transformation. And so if you think about how that complements the framework, it's really helping to enable developers to solve like end-to-end document workflows. So a lot of like the most advanced use cases that we help users solve are basically these like multi-step workflows that solve like entire business processes within a company. So, whether it's back office automation, being able to read, transform unstructured invoices, like legal contracts, et cetera, being able to do like financial modeling on top of unstructured financial data, be able to process and ingest heavy volumes of product documentation and like technical specifications, construction diagrams, and then being able to reason and make decisions on that. I'm basically highlighting a few categories of use cases that we help enable for our customers.
Okay, so these are obviously like very important business use cases. I'm curious as to when you'd want to build something like that. So you mentioned the idea of something for processing or working with legal documents compared to, I know there are a lot of like legal AI companies around, like maybe Harvey's like the most famous one. So they have like complete solutions there. So when would you want to like buy in the whole solution versus build something yourself?
It's a great question. What we're seeing with a lot of these large organizations that we work with, both open source users as well as some that are production customers with the commercial service Llama Cloud, is that they oftentimes have a little bit of both. There are point solutions that solve specific needs within certain teams. And, some of them are pretty nicely designed. There's a decent number of like vertical AI agents out there. They're also building up internal developer capabilities, because oftentimes what we see is a lot of these agents are a little bit more, either it's like a core part of what they need to build to actually do competitive differentiation. Number two, it's taps into kind of like cross-domain data sources and is something that an out-of-the-box solution can't really solve. And three, there's like common patterns where they want to build a multitude of use cases instead of just solve like a single point solution. So the reason developer teams exist, a lot of these companies, in building with AI and kind of setting up the right architecture for building these AI agents, is to really kind of stay ahead of the curve and enable them to like generalize these AI technologies to more and more use cases more rapidly. Because basically the value accumulates the more use cases you're able to build, and you can build that on top of the core architecture. So for us, like, our goal is to provide the core architecture plus tooling to help users have that core data layer that I talked about. And that's Llama Cloud, our commercial service, plus the right agent orchestration to help the developers build agents in a reliable but also easy to set up with.
Okay, so if you wanted to like buy in like your legal AI, then the marketing team also wants to buy the marketing AI, sales team wants to buy the sales AI. But if you've got this core sort of a set of components, then you can have similar agents that behave in sort of similar ways and sort of customize them for different departments.
Yeah, and to be like, a lot of these companies will probably do a little bit of both. It's just, and also some of these use cases start bleeding between different teams too. Like, I mean, I think if you think about some of the agent use cases we're seeing, like you might want to look at your finance data, but then cross-reference it with like legal or compliance regulations for these different types of checks. And you might want to kind of look at your product documentation, but then take actions in the downstream system. And actually, it's interesting. For a lot of these, you actually do need developers to help build and stitch that together, because waiting on a specific vendor to help build that for you oftentimes, doesn't work out.
Okay, all right. That seems very sensible. It's like if you've got in-house development skills, then you're going to have the capability to customize things as you want and reuse components and do things exactly as necessary.
And then on like the architecture piece, there's also some interesting things where even across like different teams, a lot of the architectural, like the way you set it up, seems quite similar. For instance, there's like a class of use cases that basically involve one, being able to parse, extract from documents, two, do some matching against a knowledge base of unstructured plus structured data, and then three, generate some report or memo. So I think a lot of things I mentioned, whether it's processing insurance claims, invoice processing, contract review, compliance checking, and like a bunch of different domains, basically fall into this. And the nice thing is if you recognize those patterns, you can basically build it instead of having to purchase like, say, 5 different solutions.
That's actually kind of cool that a lot of stuff is just, pull in some information from existing reports, maybe pull some numbers out of a database, throw it all into an AI mixer, and then you've got a new report.
Yeah, and of course, there's like pros and cons to kind of like you know, um, I guess building it versus say like a vendor solution would probably be a little bit more tailored for that specific use case. You probably have like a few more toggles to work with. What I'm seeing though is just like if you're just looking at a general assistant architecture where you can ship a bunch of things that basically can solve like a certain type of task and do it in like a repeatable way, then having this architecture allows you to ship like a bunch of these different use cases that are a little bit more simple, maybe a little bit less sophisticated than like a point solution, but then do that specific thing really well.
All right. I'd love to get more into the document parsing angle because it seems like, a lot of people have been saying, okay, any kind of unstructured data is now data, or reports or images or video, whatever. All this is data now. Can you talk me through what kind of data you might want to extract from a report and what kind of value that brings?
Yeah, for sure. Maybe just a really high level statement on, okay, so, for those of you who knew us as like LLM framework for developers, we built like a relatively general agent framework to help people build like pretty complicated, sophisticated multi-agent systems. So the question is, okay, well, then why do we also build like document processing and do that? I think part of it was because we looked at a bunch of use cases that were being built with LlamaIndex, the open source framework. And we saw that a lot of these use cases had to deal with figuring out what to do with their data. And specifically like PDFs and documents. In fact, one of the magical things of ChatGPT and the potential of it is that you can just like dump in an entire document. It can just like ingest, inhale it, and figure out what to do with that information without you really having to do a lot of like manual data entry. But then, as people actually try to do that in production, they realize a lot of things were actually failing in terms of actually understanding things from these types of documents and then making sure it's able to generalize to a variety of different document formats. Basically, I'll talk about both like the components of these documents are complex to understand, and then some specific types of like use cases for, stuff that you might want to read. One is, a lot of these documents just in a general setting have a lot of tables and charts. So, having these like giant 2D tables, sometimes it's like nested. A lot of these tables are created because humans created it for other humans to read and wasn't necessarily meant to be a very machine readable by a computer program. Number two is if you look at any sort of PowerPoint presentation, there's a ton of these like charts and diagrams, pie charts, bar charts, line graphs, and then sometimes there's things that are like super complicated. If you basically just used out of the box components to process that, it would basically render the information horribly, and then you feed it to an LLM, and then it wouldn't really understand what was going on because you didn't actually read the information from the page. So I think this is mostly just to highlight like why the problem is relatively complex. Now, in terms of assuming you have like good technology for document understanding, what we've seen a lot of people want to do from these documents is there's like kind of two main categories. One is just like represent it in like well formatted like textual format so that you could use it for retrieval. So if you want to index like a ton of documents, you just want to make sure it's parsed, processed in the right way, and that you could put it into a knowledge base for search later on. Number two is some sort of like automated structuring and extraction. So, for instance, for invoices, getting like line items, for a financial statement, like a 10K, getting like the balance sheet, P&L, et cetera, for a given company. And I think the general concept here is that it basically is automating like unstructured data ETL, right? So if you think about taking a document and then structuring it, this is a process that usually requires a ton of human input. And so instead, you're basically doing this in like an automated fashion and eliminating a lot of data entry. And therefore, you're kind of also saving a bunch of steps that you would typically require in like an ETL process. So, I mean, I think those are probably the two main use case patterns that we see with document understanding. And both of those are necessary so that you basically have some sort of either unstructured text chunk representation or some sort of structured representation for AI agents to interact with.
Okay, yeah, certainly. I think everyone's seen some horrendous PowerPoint presentation visuals and trying to turn that into some kind of structured data that you can then go work with, do kind of meaningful further analyses on. That's going to be a tricky sort of challenge. Do you need to change how you either write documents or manage documents then in order to make them more amenable if you want to then go and use them in some kind of AI application or agent?
Yeah, basically. So I think going back to the output representations, either you need to have some sort of like, I guess, text chunk, like chunk-based representation for retrieval, or you need to have some sort of like structured data representation. And in a very general sense, basically, you just need to provide the right tools to an agent so that the agent can use these tools to understand the data. And the goal of like this whole, knowledge management document processing step is how do you transform your source data into some format that AI agents can access via tools. So whether it is RAG, whether it's some sort of like structuring the data from unstructured data, these are all part of those steps.
Okay, so the idea is just like basically you need to put your documents just somewhere where they can be ingested into a vector database or whatever. Is that the idea? Or do you need to do anything beyond that?
Yeah, I think vector database, so that's the RAG piece. And that's where, let's say you have a lot of data, you want to and you want to do some sort of like retrieval from that data. So taking unstructured documents, chunking it, embedding it, putting it into a vector database for search and retrieval. But there's also actually other patterns too. So let's say you like do some sort of structuring from the unstructured data, like you get back some structured JSON from the file based on some normalized schema. Then you could put it into like MongoDB or a SQL database. And then that's like actually a different storage system than a vector database. And you can run analytics queries on top of it. And then there's also kind of like other ways of basically treating these files as tools. I think one thing that's interesting is, and I think this is a jump from RAG to agents, which is, RAG really was like a very fixed process. All you could do on top of the data was retrieval. But like, if you think about how agents might interact with files, they might want to, load in dynamically like a set of files at once. They might want to actually analyze the functions in the file to search for specific pages. They might, like for an Excel spreadsheet, look at a specific sheet, look at the values of different types of cells. And the general sense is how do we process this data and create the right tools so an agent can use these tools to interact with the data. It could be retrieval. That would be the RAG piece. It could be like text to SQL. That would be like searching structured data. It could be just like some general file functions to interact with the files.
Okay, so you want a lot more, fine control over what the agent can do with data that's in a file rather than just, I just want to read whatever the text is in there or read the information. You might want to manipulate it or do other
exactly.
things.
Right.
Okay, and so I guess the tricky part then in an enterprise context is around what happens if different documents say different things. So maybe you're like, well, I need to find whatever policy we have on something. Someone wrote a document like 3 years ago that's now out of date. Someone sent a Slack message that gives you new information. What do you do when you've got different data sources that conflict with each other?
I mean, there's actually an interesting ask. I think that specifically has been brought up as a use case. And I think it's a little bit case by case dependent, but typically, just in terms of how you would design an architecture, you probably want some sort of way to do extraction from the documents using some of our core parsing extraction capabilities. And then you have some agent workflow that can reason over these files and compare the extracted text, including the timestamps, and see whether certain things are out of date. I think the way you actually define this workflow is a function of kind of like the use case and the complexity of it. But I think the power of our, solution, both from like document parsing and the framework, is you can use our core like document processing modules to do that document understanding. And then from the agent framework, you can compose these workflows that can do like these cross-reference checks between documents, comparisons, and then generate some sort of thing at the end.
I like that there are kind of tools to help you out here. I'm not sure whether are tools the complete solution to this, or do you need to change your processes or at least have some kind of governance around how you manage documents?
Yeah, so I think for us, it's probably, we're starting off with building the right tools for developers, so to speak. And so really like making sure they have the right APIs to work with. So it's actually relatively customizable. I think you bring up a good point though, in that there's probably some potential for like a out of the box solution that will specifically look at document comparisons, versioning, and seeing if things are out of date. I think some of these things are on the roadmap in terms of more general knowledge management capabilities, in terms of just like ingesting like a bunch of documents. I think versioning is just one thing. Another one is basically just, looking for specific like types of data quality, like figuring out like, how you want to extract out insights from these documents. That's some of those things aren't things that what we have right now, but like some of these things are actually on the roadmap.
Okay, so for organizations who are thinking about how they can do knowledge management better on the documents, do you have any advice on what they need to do to improve their setup?
I think to be honest, from talking to a lot of companies, it's basically just figuring out the fact that like you probably need to have some core modules around the data processing, because I think a lot of companies still don't quite realize that to begin with. And I think like a lot of companies that come inbound realize they actually need some core modules around parsing and extraction to basically structure this data and make it available to the AI agent. So I think the building blocks, honestly, are the table stakes things to start with. And then I think the way you evolve beyond that is specifically when you think about the stack needed to build AI agents. This idea of like knowledge management, in my mind at least, is really how do you actually just build the right MCP server, so to speak, for an agent to interact with your enterprise knowledge base. And, I think using some of our stuff, you can get back these endpoints that you can just give to an agent to interact with your documents with the right tools in place. So I think when we think about this idea of knowledge management, it's specifically tailored to how do you create this like toolbox, so to speak, for an AI agent versus kind of a more human-based form of knowledge management where you're able to click a bunch of buttons on a UI and look at your files.
Knowledge management for agents is sort of different from knowledge management for humans in that case.
I think so. It starts getting into the whole product experience as well as like the API design. But yeah, I should have clarified this. Like, I think when we think about this knowledge management layer, it's specifically for how do you structure, process your documents for AI agent use, and not just like human use. Because if you think about human use, it's basically designing the right UI, UX, having the right APIs to call so that you can, kind of go through your files, like view them, get some aggregate metrics. Here it's, how do you provide all this information to an AI agent and give it the right tools to basically act upon this data?
Okay. All right. Now, I think one of the big problems that people worry about with agents over the last few months is around hallucinations and things going wrong. So how can you deal with mistakes happening? How can you be sure that you've got decent quality control in place?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And basically, I mentioned that, one, if you just don't have the right modules, like for document parsing, you're just going to get hallucinated data, no matter how good your downstream LLMs are. So let's say, I like to think we have some better modules that help users actually get more accurate data. It's not 100%, to be honest. It's still like probably in the 90s, but there's like some long tail of complexity to basically make sure that you're able to there's still some aspects where it's like not quite giving back like the exact results in those cases. And I think to basically make this knowledge management layer work for AI agents, there has to be a way of quantifying uncertainty and having citations to the sources. So quantifying uncertainty means the AI agent at least knows where it doesn't know and can kind of specifically detect spots where it basically requires a little bit of like human review. And then you absolutely need citations, particularly if you're trying to process like a large number of documents and each document's like super long. Every piece of like extracted data should have some reference back to the source document. So this at least gives the human the ability to like verify that pretty quickly.
Okay, so you've got metadata being captured basically throughout the process. So you've got, I guess, an audit trail of like what the agent did in order that you can work out what happened.
I think so. Some of the stuff to be at the time of this recording, I guess like some of these things are actually we're like actively realizing and it's things are being built, but we already have some stuff around like uncertainty quantification, for instance, be able to parse like a super complicated table. There's like a score on, how confident we are, being able to have some sort of like visual citations so that you can do some sort of layout mapping from the parse data to the source document. These types of things are useful because, later on when you build an AI agent that automates this entire workflow, you look at this specific thing, this answer, and then you ask where it came from. You want to be able to trace back visually to the source document.
Absolutely. Do you want to expand a bit more on like when you might need that audit trail? Because I guess transparency of like what agents do, that's going to become a big issue as they become more widely adopted.
I think so. And I think basically like going back to the agent form factors I mentioned, there's assistant based and there's automation. For assistant based, like the humans are already in the loop. And I think they have this behavior pattern kind of encoded in them. Anyways, like, when I do deep research, I want to look at the citations to see where the number came from. Sometimes when I search on the Google like search bar, like the AI generated answer is wrong and I want to verify like, what's going on. So I think like having citations for an assistant based use case is important because then they can actually, I feel like as people use AI, they already have this kind of like baked into their habits. And I think it becomes more challenging, but also especially important if once you start actually trusting agents to do more end-to-end automation, because then, you're going to need to have some sort of ways to like look at things after the fact, understand where the AI is like hallucinated, being able to batch review like a set of data, specifically flag things for human review, and then, have a process to basically correct and update the existing like entries or the way the agent is like process this information.
Okay, so you need that kind of feedback loop in order to be able to say, okay, it went wrong, and then next time we're going to make sure that it does the right thing.
Yeah, because like, in an automation-based use case, if it's 99% accurate, but not 100%, then 1% of the time it's going to give you like issues, right? So like basically you kind of need to have some sort of like human review in that case.
Okay. Yeah, I can imagine that's going to have some pretty big impacts on people's workflows then and like on what their jobs are. 'Cause I guess if the agent's doing sort of 99% of the work and then you're sort of reviewing stuff, is there a good new workflow, or is it just people are going to spend a lot of time trying to debug agents?
Yeah, actually, I mean, it's a good point. And thinking back to your question on the knowledge management piece, like especially in terms of like, what does agentic knowledge management entail? Probably needs to have some UX around human review validation, right? Because if you're going to be like a data processing layer for AI agents, do you want to make sure you have the right toolbox for AI agents to access? But you also need to have some sort of proper UX to identify, review data, update it, and have that interface baked in as part of the system. And glad you brought it up because that's definitely part of like what we're building up as part of Llama Cloud. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. You want to have a nice experience for the human reviewers because otherwise it's just going to be some sort of nightmare of like trying to delve into agentic, like I guess all the stuff they spit out. Like, oh, I was thinking about this, and then blah 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 blah, and that's going to be tricky and probably dreadful.
Yeah, totally. I think this is like human in the loop is in general important for agents, but especially in the part where you're like dealing with a ton of unstructured data and doing agentic reasoning over it, like you absolutely need a way to do like human review validation.
All right, super. Now, earlier you mentioned the idea of an MCP server, so I'd love to learn a bit more about Model Context Protocol. Like, so what is it and what can you do with it?
Yeah, I mean MCP and also there's A2A from Google that was just announced, and I'm sure in the next month or two there will be protocols from other companies that are getting announced. So MCP is specifically a way for agents to interact with tools. This idea of agents that interact with tools, to be very clear, is not net new. It's just like, people were building it basically since like 2023. It's just like nowadays there's like a standardized protocol. The nice thing about a protocol is that now people can build against the protocol without having to build like a bespoke thing. And that like by building a server, it can plug into multiple clients instead of just plugging into a specific client. So what that means is like, I think why people got really into MCP is because like Cursor and Claude basically both were MCP clients. So if you built like an MCP server, it would just seamlessly plug into Claude and Cursor. So you could basically get immediate value from it. So that is cool. I mean, like, again, it's not like a new idea, but the fact that there's a standardized protocol means like server developers get way faster time to value from like being able to like see, the stuff, how their stuff they're building is like really being impactful on existing AI tools. To give you a quick framing of how we fit in, so we have, again, the end-to-end tools to help developers build these types of AI agents over their data. We have the document processing piece. We also have an agent framework. On the document processing piece, it probably makes sense to see it as an MCP server. So just like, I think basically this is what I mentioned with knowledge management for AI agents. Think of us as like a knowledge management toolbox for your AI agents. Your AI agent can call out to us to basically parse, structure, get back information about your data, feed that information to an LLM to enable it to interact with the files. As a framework, we help developers build agents. So we have actually built integrations there too. You can build like a client agent that can interact with any MCP server as a tool. You can also build a server agent that other people can call out to. I think one interesting thing about MCP and also A2A is MCP seems to be a little bit more geared towards agent calling out to tools. Nowadays, like with A2A from Google, it's more about agents calling out to other agents. And there's going to be some interesting maybe collisions, but also differences between the two. And I'd be curious to see how it standardizes. And I don't completely know yet.
All right. So the general idea is really just about you want to make it easier and standardized for agents to communicate with tools or agents to communicate with other agents. And so if you want to swap out different components, you're not going to have to write a ton of custom code every time. It's a case of
exactly
do the same thing each time. All right. So that sounds like it's going to make it easier to scale the number of agents that you can create.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's going to make it easier to scale and then also easier, like way easier to integrate. I think that's the advantage of a protocol. You can just directly integrate it with anything that implements MCP on the client side.
Okay, so if you've got existing bits of, I don't know, sales software or something, it's probably going to support MCP, and then you can just plug in your agent into that. And
exactly. I think what this does is it probably lowers the barrier to building these types of like connectors, because every company will just build their own MCP server. And then having a protocol means like the connector part is like much easier to solve because there's already a standardized interface for things to communicate with each other, at least in the hypothetical sense. I don't know how practically like different MCP clients might have different expectations on what the server actually gives back. And then that might lead to a lot of complexity in API design. So I don't really know yet. But like, yeah, like Salesforce, SAP, whatever, like every workplace app will probably have their own like server that an agent can interact with. We'll have servers around, document processing, knowledge management, and making sure that you're basically able to access all the huge volumes of data that you have available to you. And then this will just be easier to plug into any sort of AI agent front end.
Okay, this seems very useful stuff. So I'd like to talk a bit about what you need to do in order to start building your own agents. So first of all, what do you think are the most important skills that organizations need in-house if they want to be able to create their own agents?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two. I mean, there's one just like general AI skills I think everyone should learn. I mean, whether you're a developer or not. I mean, I would just, I use probably ChatGPT and Claude to generate like 50% plus my written content these days. I'm not ashamed of it. It's basically just like, I think how the world is moving. And then if you're a developer, I mean, I'm obviously biased, but I would recommend checking out our documentation. So basically, we have a lot of quick start tutorials, whether you're a beginner or you're a more advanced user, to basically either build an agent, a multi-agent system in like 5 lines of code, or, just use the core orchestration framework to basically build very deeply custom agents that can interact with any services. We integrate with pretty much every LLM, vector store, embedding model tools out there. So there should be a decent amount of resources to get started. In terms of like just general skills of learning, what I would do is it kind of depends how deep you want to go. If you're mostly just looking to solve the specific task, then I mean, I think the quick start stuff for you using the higher level stuff is like fine, because you're more trying to figure out how to solve like a specific problem. If you're really trying to just deeply understand AI a little bit more, I would try the build from scratch approach, where like try not to use the out of the box modules, and then see if you can just reason from first principles and like learn the techniques. And I think if you want to be a proper AI engineer, I think that's probably like a core skill set that you should learn. I think there's a difference between folks that are a little bit more geared towards building these AI algorithms, and then folks that are like adapting it for a product. And I think the former probably needs to understand the fundamentals a little bit more.
Okay, so that's interesting. It's like, I guess, the lower down the stack you go, the more sort of core or fundamental skills you're going to get. But you mentioned the idea of a proper AI engineer. Go on, talk me through what's the sort of what's the skill set for a proper AI engineer?
Yeah, I mean, I think an AI engineer needs to deeply understand the like different types of architectures, the trade-off between them, and then figuring out how to solve a problem from first principles while like understanding these trade-offs. And I think to me, it's a negative signal if they like regurgitate abstractions that are in existing frameworks, because that to me just means they like bought into the framework but don't really understand the core techniques. And it's really about how do you like understand the limitations of models, but then, figure out how to build the right algorithms around them to solve a problem and have in mind like the right set of trade-offs.
All right, yeah. I like the idea that yeah, you want to be able to solve things from first principles, get to a solution yourself rather than just relying on them.
To be clear, this is like core AI. Like I think, there's probably a decent chunk of developers are more just interested in adapting this to build product, which I also think is super fair and also very important. I just think like they're two slightly distinct sets of skills.
Okay. So there's like software engineer using AI is different from I'm building a core sort of AI product.
Yeah, like algorithm, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes, I mean, one person can do both. I mean, hey, like there's a lot of like engineers that wear multiple hats. It's just like I think they're slightly distinct.
Oh yeah. If you're doing both, then probably not a lot of free time because there's a lot to learn there, a lot of skills. All right, wonderful. So just do you have any final advice on how organizations can make use of AI agents?
I think I can speak to like the developer teams because I think that's the part where we build some of the core products for. I would try to figure out like what are the pieces of the architecture that you really want to centralize so that you can actually start building not just like one agent, but multiple agents on top. And for us, a lot of the core components really are around like some of the foundational data layer, document processing, extraction, and then being able to have like, the proper architectures that operate on top of this data. There are different companies at different stages of maturity. Some are just trying to get the initial use case out the door. Some have like a dozen plus agents in production already. And what we've seen from these more advanced companies is that, having the architecture in place really helps your developers go way faster in shipping these use cases and provides that compelling case for why you should have developer teams like build things.
All right. Nice. Yeah. You got to have that case for why you want developers to do things rather than just having them work on all sorts. Excellent. So finally, I always want recommendations for people to follow. Whose work are you most excited about at the moment?
Yeah, I read a bunch of different data sources from like all different types of people. I think from like a core model perspective, and I think of recent examples, I follow like Shenyu Yao, like the React author, and he has always some interesting thoughts on just like the state of like model development, where foundational models are going. So that's just an example.
All right, wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for your time, Jerry.
All right, thanks for your time.